We are so thrilled that you finally decided to stop being so terribly selfish and treat our entire church congregation to this magnificent anniversary feast. My arrogant mother-in-law announced, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm as her diamond necklace caught the light of the extravagant crystal chandelier above us. The private VIP dining suite was packed to the absolute brim with 40 greedy guests, their plates overflowing with the decimated remains of expensive Wagyu beef, premium lobster tails, and empty bottles of vintage champagne. They had spent the entire evening loudly mocking my modest emerald suit and my natural hair, convinced I was a struggling, pathetic financial failure who was about to be trapped into paying their astronomical $9.500 restaurant bill. So, I simply looked at her, rested my hands calmly on the pristine linen tablecloth, and gave her a slow, terrifying smile. I did not shed a single tear of humiliation. I did not scream or beg for mercy. I simply raised two fingers, whispered two sentences to the head waiter, and watched their entire fake, luxurious empire burn to ash in less than 10 minutes. What they failed to realize was that I was not a lowly corporate consultant. I was the silent owner of the building they were currently eating in. Let me tell you how I dismantled the toxic monsters who severely underestimated my quiet power. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and remember, silence is never a sign of submission. It is simply the calm preparation before the total annihilation of your enemies. The opulent crystal chandelier hanging gracefully above the mahogany banquet table cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the people who unfortunately shared a legal connection to my life. We were supposed to be celebrating the 10th wedding anniversary of my sister-in-law, Patrice, and her notoriously lazy husband, Dion. My husband, Andre, had enthusiastically pitched this gathering to me as an intimate, peaceful dinner for just the four of us, plus his critical mother, Beatrice. It was supposedly a rare, genuine opportunity to mend the deep, festering wounds after 5 long years of extremely strained, low-contact relations. I am 32 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I had been the designated scapegoat for a family utterly obsessed with the desperate illusion of old money prestige. They demanded absolute perfection and aggressive social climbing, and in their superficial eyes, I was a disappointment. When I first married Andre, I was a quiet, ambitious woman who preferred late nights studying advanced market algorithms over attending their ostentatious, fake wealth charity galas. They constantly labeled me as a stubborn, low-class outsider who was dragging down their pristine family aesthetic. They never once bothered to ask what I actually did during those long, quiet hours working late in my home office. If they had spent even 10 seconds looking past their own suffocating arrogance, they would have known that my supposedly modest little consulting business was actually a specialized, ruthlessly efficient commercial real estate intelligence firm. Over the past 5 years, while they were busy maxing out high-interest credit cards to buy designer handbags they could not afford, I had been quietly acquiring a multi-million-dollar portfolio of prime commercial properties across the entire metropolitan area. But I kept my mouth shut. I let them believe I was still struggling to make ends meet, because a seasoned predator never announces its presence before the steel trap snaps shut. As I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy ornate glass doors of Le Chiel, the city's most exclusive and impossibly expensive fine dining establishment, my stomach tightened slightly. Not with anxiety, but with the cold, calculated anticipation of a chess grandmaster seeing the final moves of a flawless checkmate. The ambient lighting of the restaurant cast a warm, inviting glow, but the air felt crisp and electric to me. The rich, buttery scent of imported truffles and expensive perfumes hung heavy in the atmosphere, creating a stifling environment of pure, unadulterated excess. I wore a tailored emerald green power suit, my natural hair styled flawlessly, projecting an aura of quiet, untouchable confidence. I gave my name to the impeccably dressed hostess, who immediately offered a deep, knowing smile. She did not just recognize my name, she knew who I was. She respectfully escorted me past the softly lit main dining room, navigating the labyrinth of wealthy patrons, and guided me directly toward the highly restricted private VIP suite, located at the back of the luxury building. When she pushed those heavy oak double doors open, the sheer volume of chaotic noise hit me like a physical, aggressive wave. This was no intimate, peaceful dinner for four. The polished marble banquet table stretched endlessly from one end of the spacious room to the other, packed shoulder to shoulder with 40 loud, demanding people. I immediately recognized Beatrice's entire board of judgmental church elders, all wearing their extravagant, flashy Sunday suits on a random Thursday evening. I saw Patrice's loud, obnoxious sorority sisters taking endless, narcissistic flash photos for their social media accounts. I saw Dion, Patrice's notoriously unemployed husband, laughing obnoxiously loud with a heavy glass of dark, expensive liquor firmly grasped in his hand. And sitting right at the absolute center of the chaotic storm was Beatrice, wearing a dramatic, sequined evening gown and a thick diamond necklace, holding court over the table like a self-appointed, delusional queen. The absolute devastation on the table was genuinely staggering. They had deliberately not waited for him to arrive. The pristine marble surface was littered with towering, multi-tiered silver platters holding the pathetic remnants of imported seafood towers. Cracked lobster shells, discarded king crab legs, and oyster remnants were piled absurdly high. Wooden cutting boards held the picked clean bones of giant Wagyu tomahawk steaks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Empty, dark green bottles of Dom Perignon and extremely rare, aged vintage wines were scattered recklessly everywhere, treated like cheap soda cans at a frat party. They had aggressively ordered the absolute most expensive, decadent items on the exclusive menu for 40 uninvited people, and they were unapologetic about it. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of their brazen entitlement, Andre suddenly appeared directly at my side. He grabbed my elbow with a tight, aggressively controlling grip and pulled me fully into the brightly lit room. He wore a flashy, branded designer suit that he definitely could not afford on his mid-level, thoroughly mediocre financial advisor salary. He flashed a brilliant, entirely fake smile for the watching crowd and forcefully led me toward the absolute only empty seat remaining in the entire spacious room. It was deliberately, maliciously placed at the far, drafty end of the long table, isolating me from the supposed guests of honor. I sat down smoothly, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable icy mask. I glared at Andre, silently demanding a rational explanation with my eyes, but he simply refused to make any direct contact. He immediately turned his back on me and eagerly scurried away to take his prestigious seat right next to his domineering mother. The trap had been painstakingly set, the audience was captive, and the miserable show was just about to begin. Beatrice slowly tapped her expensive crystal champagne flute with a heavy silver spoon, aggressively demanding the entire room's immediate and undivided attention. The 40 loud, obnoxious guests quickly quieted down, turning their judgmental, critical eyes directly toward my isolated end of the long table. My mother-in-law smiled, a shockingly cold, calculating expression that never reached her dark eyes. She slowly looked me up and down, her harsh gaze pausing very deliberately on my elegantly styled natural hair. A soft, condescending chuckle escaped her glossed lips, carrying across the dead, silent room. She loudly welcomed me to the extravagant dinner, projecting her shrill voice so that even the waitstaff lingering in the hallway could hear her. She dramatically announced that she was just so glad I could somehow manage to take a tiny bit of time out of my supposedly modest, struggling little schedule to grace their grand celebration with my presence. She made sure to emphasize the word modest with a thick, sickening layer of fake Southern charm. She then turned to the entire captive church board and loudly declared that I was just a humble, exhausted consultant who worked far too hard for my tiny, insignificant paychecks. The younger sorority sisters snickered loudly, aggressively whispering behind their manicured hands while shooting me pitiful, mocking glances. Patrice leaned aggressively across the marble table, making certain her flashy, oversized designer watch caught the bright chandelier light. She looked directly at my tailored emerald suit and offered a viciously backhanded compliment, loudly asking if I had managed to find such a quaint, interesting outfit on clearance at a discount rack. She then proceeded to tell the entire silent table that it was such a terrible shame I refused to chemically relax my hair, loudly claiming that natural ethnic styles just did not fit the elegant, high-class ambiance of an establishment like Luxiel. She laughed a high, grating laugh and loudly supposed that I simply did not possess the financial budget required for a proper high-end luxury salon. The humiliation was expertly, maliciously designed to completely break my spirit, to put me in my so-supposed place in front of their entire influential social circle. They desperately wanted to remind me that, in their arrogant eyes, I was nothing but a low-class, financially insecure outsider who should feel lucky to even be vaguely associated with their supposedly prestigious, wealthy family. I vividly remembered the countless painful times they had aggressively excluded me from major family holidays, falsely claiming my mere presence would somehow ruin the flawless aesthetic of their carefully curated, fake wealth gatherings. Now they were explicitly using my silent presence as a captive ass for their grand, pathetic performance of superiority. The supposedly pious church elders, who should have known much better, simply nodded along enthusiastically with Beatrice's cruel, inappropriate assessments. One of the older, balding men even had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to loudly suggest that a woman's true, divine glory was only found in her absolute financial and emotional submission to her strong husband and her wise mother-in-law. I felt my neatly manicured nails digging slightly into the soft palms of my hands under the heavy table, but I forced my facial expression to remain placid. I knew with absolute certainty that reacting with any visible anger or defensive frustration would only give them the sick, twisted satisfaction they so desperately craved. They explicitly wanted me to fit a pathetic stereotype. They wanted an angry, unhinged, emotional reaction so they could immediately point their manicured fingers and loudly validate their horrific mistreatment of me. I flatly refused to give them even a single fraction of that twisted satisfaction. I slowly turned my head toward Andre, fully expecting the man I had married to firmly defend his loyal wife against his toxic family's blatant, aggressive disrespect. Instead, he simply leaned close to my ear, his jaw tight with suppressed, nervous rage. He aggressively whispered, ordering me to stop looking so intensely miserable and cold. He commanded me to just smile, to blindly play along, and to quietly keep the peace for the sake of the pristine family image. He hissed that his mother was respected in their wealthy church community, and I needed to show proper, unwavering deference tonight. I stared coldly at the sweating man I had unfortunately married, feeling a profound, heavy sense of absolute disgust wash over my entire body. He was definitely not a real partner. He was a pathetic, terrified coward who eagerly allowed his vicious family to continually use me as an emotional punching bag, just to artificially elevate their own extremely fragile egos. I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not argue, I simply sat there still, radiating a cold, impenetrable calm that clearly unsettled him. My terrifying silence only seemed to agitate Beatrice much further. She desperately wanted a loud, explosive reaction, and when she failed to get one, she aggressively escalated the highly volatile situation. She waved the nervous waiter over, with a dramatic, sweeping flourish of her jeweled hand. She loudly announced to the entire packed table that since they were joyously celebrating Patrice and Dion's milestone anniversary, along with her own early birthday, they positively needed to order the most expensive, decadent desserts the establishment had to offer. She arrogantly commanded the silent waiter to immediately bring out the gold leaf chocolate cakes, the imported artisan truffles, and another expensive round of the $900 vintage champagne for every single person in the crowded room. Patrice cheered obnoxiously, raising her half-empty crystal glass, and aggressively mocking my continued silence by loudly stating she truly hoped my cute little consultant salary could somehow handle the blinding sight of real, untouchable luxury. As the long, agonizing evening dragged on, the lavish, pathetic displays of their fake wealth became increasingly, dangerously absurd. Patrice spent 20 solid minutes loudly complaining about a microscopic, practically invisible scratch on the hardware of her new designer handbag, ensuring everyone at the table knew how many thousands of dollars it supposedly cost. Dion eagerly joined in, obnoxiously boasting about imaginary stock market wins while sneakily, rapidly downing the absolute most expensive aged whiskey on the extensive menu. All the while, Andre sat there practically glowing with a sick, borrowed pride, acting exactly as though he had single-handedly funded this gluttonous gathering of the supposed elite. He kept leaning over his chair to forcefully remind me how lucky I was to be seated at this prestigious table, surrounded by such immense greatness. They feasted on the decadent, gold-covered desserts while I sat quietly, with an empty, sweating water glass. They laughed aggressively, they took countless group photos, and they made elaborate, sweeping toasts to their own profound, undeniable greatness. Dion, the loudly boasting brother-in-law who had not worked a steady, reliable job in over 3 years, continued to brag about his supposed high-yield financial investments. I knew for an absolute, documented fact that he was currently drowning in terrifying, underground sports betting debts. They were all collectively playing a grand, delusional game of pretend, happily wearing thick masks of immense wealth and strict religious piety, while their actual, miserable lives were built on a rotting foundation of lies, crippling debt, and profound toxicity. I simply watched them, carefully and methodically memorizing every single flushed face, every cruel insult, every condescending, arrogant laugh. They genuinely thought they had finally trapped me. They firmly believed I was just a financially struggling, helpless woman who would be easily intimidated by their sheer numbers and their aggressive, overwhelming social status. They thought I would predictably cower under the judgmental stares of the wealthy church elders and eventually beg for their meager acceptance. They had no idea who I truly was. They had zero idea that my modest consulting job was merely a carefully constructed cover, a quiet, unassuming title I specifically used to avoid drawing unwanted attention to my actual wealth. They did not know that I currently possessed the immense power to permanently dismantle their entire fraudulent facade with a single, calm phone call. As the last drops of expensive champagne were poured into crystal flutes and the ruined dessert plates were efficiently cleared away by the nervous staff, the atmosphere in the private room drastically shifted. The jovial, booming laughter suddenly died down, swiftly replaced by a tense, expectant, greedy energy. Beatrice delicately dabbed the corners of her mouth with a crisp linen napkin and exchanged a knowing, malicious glance with Patrice. Andre suddenly sat up much straighter, nervously adjusting his cheap tie and refusing to look in my general direction. The expensive trap they had spent the entire evening carefully setting was finally ready to be sprung. They were just about to forcefully demand payment for their staggering, sickening excess, fully, arrogantly expecting me to quietly shoulder the financial burden of their unhinged gluttony. But I was not the helpless, fragile victim they so arrogantly assumed I was. I was the silent, calculated architect of their impending, inescapable destruction, and the main event was just about to begin. The heavy oak doors swung open once more, but this time no one was carrying silver platters of lobster or fresh, sweating bottles of vintage champagne. The head waiter stepped directly into the private dining room. His posture was rigid, his facial expression an entirely unreadable, flawless mask of strict professional hospitality. In his white-gloved hand, he carefully carried a thick black leather checkbook. The bright golden embossed logo of Le Ciel caught the ambient light, glittering like a dangerous warning sign. The booming, arrogant laughter and boisterous, chaotic conversations around the marble banquet table began to rapidly quiet down. The sharp clinking of crystal glasses ceased. The sound of heavy silverware, aggressively scraping against fine china, faded into a thick, expectant silence. 40 pairs of greedy eyes covertly tracked the waiter as he made his long, deliberate walk across the spacious room. He smoothly approached the center of the table, stopping directly behind Andre with a crisp, practiced motion. The waiter placed the heavy leather checkbook squarely on the polished marble surface, right between Andre and Beatrice. The staggering total printed firmly on the itemized receipt tucked inside that expensive leather binding was $9.450. I knew the exact precise amount because my mental math was flawless, and I knew what a packed room full of greedy, unhinged opportunists could rapidly consume in under 2 hours. Andre did not even bother opening the dark folder to quickly review the charges. He did not check the long itemized list to ensure the 40 giant steaks and dozen expensive bottles of champagne were accounted for correctly. He did not reach for his wallet. Instead, without missing a single arrogant beat, he placed his fingertips gently on the smooth black leather and pushed it firmly across the cool marble. The heavy book slid smoothly across the table, stopping precisely 1 inch from my half-empty water glass. His movement was so practiced, so terrifyingly smooth. It was painfully obvious he had mentally rehearsed this exact, specific moment in his head 100 different times. He leaned far back in his plush chair, casually adjusting the frayed cuffs of his cheap suit jacket, and arrogantly crossed his arms. A massively smug, satisfied grin spread across his sweating face. Beatrice closely mirrored his exact expression, resting her sharp chin on her folded hands, as she stared intensely at me from across the long table. Patrice stopped applying her expensive lip gloss and snapped her compact aggressively shut, leaning far forward just to closely watch the impending show. Dion wiped a thick bead of sweat from his forehead, looking physically relieved that the immense financial burden of his drinking binge was officially being passed off to someone else entirely. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the gesture hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They were waiting for my predictable reaction. They were eagerly waiting for sheer panic to set in, for my eyes to widen in complete terror as I looked at a massive restaurant bill that equated to several solid months of rent for a normal, hard-working citizen. They fully expected me to argue loudly, to cry hysterically, or to embarrass myself by openly begging for their financial help. They wanted to eagerly witness my complete, devastating financial humiliation, right in front of their judgmental church community. I simply looked quietly down at the heavy leather checkbook, then slowly raised my steady gaze to directly meet my husband's waiting eyes. My facial expression remained terrifyingly blank, giving him nothing to feed his rapidly inflating ego. The heavy silence in the VIP room stretched on for several excruciating seconds, tightening drastically like a tightly coiled metal spring. Finally, Andre confidently decided it was the perfect time to loudly address his captive, eager audience. Andre stood up abruptly, projecting his booming voice so every single greedy person in the spacious room could hear him clearly. He cleared his throat dramatically, commanding the absolute attention of the silent church elders, the eagerly watching sorority sisters, and the various freeloading guests. He raised his hands in a grand gesture of magnanimous, fake benevolence, flawlessly playing the role of the proud, forgiving, wealthy patriarch to absolute perfection. He announced that he wanted to take a very brief, meaningful moment to express his profound, deep gratitude. He looked directly down at me, his wide smile dripping with fake affection, loudly declaring that his lovely, quiet wife recently received a cute little quarterly bonus from her modest consulting job. He used the word little with deliberate, mocking emphasis, ensuring everyone clearly understood my financial contributions were somewhat cute, but ultimately insignificant compared to his fabricated wealth. He then confidently told the entire room I had aggressively insisted on treating everyone tonight. He loudly claimed I desperately wanted to cover the entire cost of the extravagant, gluttonous feast as a sincere, emotional apology for being so terribly distant from the family over the past 5 difficult years. He beautifully painted a fictional picture of a highly repentant, desperate prodigal wife who was finally coming to her proper senses and practically begging for readmission into their prestigious, wealthy inner circle. He spun an elaborate narrative where I willingly emptied my supposedly meager savings account just to buy their forgiveness, to properly atone for my supposed deep selfishness and complete lack of traditional family loyalty. The immediate reaction from the packed room was instantaneous and utterly nauseating. Beatrice pressed a dramatic hand to her chest, effectively feigning a look of deep, overwhelming emotional movement. She nodded slowly, closing her eyes as if silently, profoundly thanking heavens for my sudden spiritual awakening. The supposedly pious church elders, sitting comfortably with their bellies full of premium Wagyu beef and top-tier vintage wine, broke into a loud round of warm, approving applause. They clapped their hands, their faces positively beaming with deep, condescending grace. One older elder loudly called out a religious blessing, aggressively praising my newfound dedication to strict family values and my supposedly eager willingness to make financial sacrifices for the greater good of the righteous household. Another elder loudly commended Andre for his immense saintly patience in firmly leading me back to the proper, righteous path. Patrice happily raised her half-empty champagne flute, blowing me a sarcastic, dramatic kiss across the table, while silently mouthing the mocking words, "Thank you." The younger sorority sisters eagerly chimed in, offering polite but mocking cheers. I sat still, quietly absorbing the sheer, terrifying magnitude of their collective delusion. They were quite literally clapping for my blatant financial extortion. They were loudly celebrating the fact that they had maliciously ambushed me, secretly ordered nearly $10,000 worth of luxury food and liquor behind my back, and were now publicly forcing me to foot the bill under the twisted guise of a spiritual apology. The absolute, staggering weight of their incredible entitlement would have easily crushed anyone else. It was a flawless masterclass in emotional manipulation, designed to trap me in a corner where simply refusing to pay would instantly make me look like a bitter, unrepentant villain ruining a beautiful emotional family reconciliation. They genuinely thought they had backed me into an inescapable, public social corner. They firmly believed the immense pressure of the wealthy audience would forcefully compel me to quietly pull out my credit card and submissively accept my brutal punishment. I did not panic, I did not raise my voice, nor did I shed even a single solitary tear of frustration. I remained remarkably calm, my posture elegantly relaxed. I slowly picked up my sweating water glass, took a measured, slow sip, and set it carefully back down on the pristine white tablecloth. The crowd watched me closely, waiting for the inevitable, tearful surrender. I did not reach down into my heavy designer bag to retrieve my wallet. I did not even attempt to open the incredibly thick leather checkbook sitting ominously directly in front of me on the marble table. Instead, I calmly raised my right hand and extended two fingers elegantly into the air, instantly catching the full, undivided attention of the trained head waiter, who was still standing discreetly near the ornate mahogany back wall. He immediately stepped forward, without a single second of hesitation, carefully navigating around the loudly celebrating, clapping guests, and stopped directly beside my plush dining chair. He leaned down slightly, bringing his right ear close to my face, anticipating specific, complex instructions for split payments, or perhaps a corporate expense account authorization. I did not raise my voice above a breathless, quiet murmur. I leaned in close and whispered two short sentences directly into his ear. I spoke with absolute, terrifying clarity, ensuring he heard every single crisp syllable over the loud din of the lingering, obnoxious applause. As the heavy words fully registered, the professional waiter's flawless composure slipped for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened drastically, darting nervously from me directly to Andre, then rapidly back to the closed, ominous leather checkbook resting untouched on the table. A flash of profound, terrified realization washed over his pale face. He quickly composed himself, snapping back forcefully into his rigid, formal posture. He gave me a deep, respectful nod, fully acknowledging the immense, severe gravity of the command I had just delivered. Without uttering a single solitary word to Andre or the rest of the loud table, the head waiter stood up straight, turned sharply on his polished heel, and walked briskly out of the private dining room. He left the heavy leather checkbook sitting untouched right where it was on the polished marble surface. Across the wide table, Beatrice and Patrice quickly exchanged triumphant, arrogant smirks. Andre let out a loud, boastful laugh, happily clapping Dion hard on the shoulder. They were utterly convinced that my quiet interaction with the waiter was a pathetic display of meek, absolute submission. They blindly assumed I had just discreetly provided a limitless black hammer or quietly authorized a wire transfer from my depleted savings to cover their sickening gluttony. They fully believed they had decisively won the war, successfully breaking my stubborn spirit and draining my finances in one swift, brilliant maneuver. The church elders continued to nod in profound, deep approval, oblivious to the harsh reality of the devastating situation rapidly unfolding right under their noses. Andre confidently poured himself another generous, overflowing glass of expensive wine, happily basking in his temporary fragile glory. They eagerly went back to their loud, obnoxious conversations, celebrating their cruel, unearned victory, unaware of the devastating storm rapidly gathering right directly outside those heavy oak doors. 10 long minutes stretched agonizingly on. The exclusive VIP room of Le Ciel remained blissfully oblivious to the impending disaster. Andre was busy loudly recounting a fabricated story about a recent, highly expensive luxury golf trip, aggressively gesturing broadly with his half-empty wineglass. Beatrice nodded along occasionally, loudly interjecting to ensure the judgmental church elders knew just how expensive the exclusive country club membership truly was. Patrice was busy taking countless selfies, aggressively pouting her glossed lips, and ensuring the remnants of the Wagyu tomahawk steak were clearly visible in the background to impress her superficial social media followers. Dion simply sat slumped entirely in his chair, quietly swirling the amber liquid in his heavy glass. Detached from reality, I remained still in my seat at the far end of the long marble table, watching them happily bask in their unearned, temporary glory. My glass of sparkling water sat half empty. I took another slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the expensive crystal. It was the absolute only sound I made. I was content to let them enjoy their final fleeting moments of absolute, pathetic delusion. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room suddenly swung open. The professional head waiter stepped back inside, but this time he was not alone. He was closely flanked by a junior server, and his entire demeanor had shifted drastically from accommodating, polite hospitality to a rigid, uncompromising professionalism. He firmly held a sleek, black digital point-of-sale terminal tightly in his white-gloved hand. The soft, chaotic chatter and arrogant, booming laughter around the table began to die down rapidly once again. Everyone blindly assumed the waiter was simply returning to collect the heavy leather checkbook and present me with the finalized receipt. Andre eagerly puffed out his chest, rapidly adjusting his posture to look as commanding as possible. He shot a smug, very arrogant look down the entire length of the table toward me, silently gloating over what he mistakenly thought was my complete, utterly devastating financial surrender. The head waiter walked rapidly down the length of the room, his firm footsteps silent on the thick, plush carpet. However, instead of stopping beside my chair, he kept purposefully walking. He bypassed me without so much as a single fleeting glance. He marched straight to the exact center of the long table and stopped directly behind Andre. The room fell into a sudden, confused, thick hush. Andre looked up rapidly, his brow furrowing in visible irritation. He confidently opened his mouth, likely to loudly scold the waiter for making a stupid mistake and forcefully direct him back to my end of the table. Before Andre could utter a single, highly arrogant syllable, the head waiter firmly placed the black digital payment terminal squarely on the marble surface, right directly next to Andre's empty dessert plate. The waiter stood tall, his voice projecting clearly across the dead, utterly silent room. He loudly stated that the lady sitting quietly at the end of the table had explicitly authorized payment for her single, solitary glass of sparkling water. He proudly announced that her extremely small transaction was completely finished and her personal tab was closed. He then looked directly down at Andre. His tone was polite, but it carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute, unyielding authority. He informed Andre that the remaining balance of $9,450 was entirely unsettled. He stated loudly, ensuring every single listening church elder and recording sorority sister heard him that the outstanding bill was now Andre's direct responsibility to clear immediately. A collective loud gasp rippled through the VIP room. The pious church elders exchanged highly startled, extremely wide-eyed glances. The young sorority sisters quickly lowered their phones, the bright screens going dark. Beatrice instantly stiffened in her plush chair, her back suddenly rigid, her powdered jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Patrice entirely stopped mid-selfie, her phone hovering awkwardly in the silent air, the comforting illusion of my financial submission shattered into a million tiny jagged pieces. I sat quietly resting my hands in my lap, maintaining a flawlessly neutral expression as I watched the warm blood drain and rapidly from my lying husband's face. Andre stared at the digital payment machine as if it were a venomous snake coiled aggressively on the table. He blinked rapidly, his terrified mind struggling intensely to process the monumental reversal of power. He let out a harsh, nervous bark of fake laughter, looking around frantically at the church elders to desperately try and play the severe situation off as a ridiculous, temporary misunderstanding. He loudly told the waiter that there had clearly been a stupid communication error. He pointed a aggressive, shaking finger directly down the table at me, declaring that his wife was supposed to handle the tab tonight as a special, generous family treat. He loudly commanded the waiter to immediately take the machine back to my end of the table and forcefully run my card. The professional head waiter did not flinch, he did not move a single, solitary inch. He firmly clasped his gloved hands behind his straight back and repeated his clear statement. He coldly informed Andre that my specific instructions were explicitly clear, my single item was fully paid for, and the luxury establishment was now looking to him, the proud host of the party, to settle the remaining debt. The waiter then gently but firmly tapped the dark screen of the terminal, highlighting the staggering total glowing in bright white numbers. Sheer panic, raw and completely unfiltered, finally breached Andre's carefully constructed, fake facade. A heavy bead of cold sweat formed at his receding hairline, tracking incredibly slowly down his temple. He realized the waiter was not going to back down, he fully realized I was not going to step in and save him. More importantly, he realized the entire church board, his judgmental mother's friends, and his sister's superficial social circle were watching his every single panicked move with bated breath. He had to maintain his wealthy, powerful patriarch image at all costs. He forcefully forced a wide, strained smile, letting out another booming, fake laugh. He loudly announced to the silent room that his wife was just playing a silly, dramatic little game, but it did not matter because he was more than happy to effortlessly take care of his beautiful family. Andre aggressively reached inside his cheap, tailored jacket and pulled out his expensive designer wallet. With a theatrical, desperate flourish, he aggressively extracted a heavy, sleek metal credit card. He aggressively tossed it directly onto the marble table. It landed with a loud, satisfying clank that echoed in the quiet room. It was an aggressive display of supposed wealth, a desperate attempt to regain absolute control of the shattered narrative. He slid the heavy metal card into the digital terminal with a forceful, arrogant shove. He confidently looked up at the very silent church elders, offering them a reassuring, fake wink. The black machine rapidly processed the chip, the room waited in suffocating silence. A tiny, glowing loading circle spun quickly on the bright screen. Then a sharp, incredibly loud beep aggressively cut through the heavy air. The digital screen flashed a bright, angry red. The professional head waiter looked down briefly at the screen, then looked back directly up at Andre. His deep voice remained devoid of any emotion as he firmly delivered the devastating news. He stated clearly and loudly that the premium card had been declined. The heavy silence in the VIP suite deepened significantly, instantly transforming into a thick, palpable tension. Andre's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching to see if anyone had heard the loud waiter's devastating declaration. Everyone had heard it. The judgmental church elders were now sitting up straight, their previous, warm expressions of admiration replaced by deep, uncomfortable frowns. Beatrice let out a small, entirely strangled squeak. Her meticulously crafted fake smile began to uncontrollably twitch at the corners. She looked intensely at her supposedly successful son, with a horrifying mixture of shock and rapidly rising fury, her dark eyes silently, aggressively demanding that he fix this catastrophic, public humiliation immediately. Andre frantically scrambled to pull the heavy metal card out of the machine. He nervously stammered, his cracked voice practically failing, wildly claiming that the wealthy bank must have incorrectly placed a fraud alert on the premium account, because the transaction amount was so unusually large. He laughed nervously, aggressively wiping the rapidly accumulating sweat from his terrified forehead with the back of his shaking hand. He insisted it was just a ridiculous, common security protocol that frequently happens to successful, high-net-worth individuals like himself. His sweating hands were visibly, violently shaking as he dug deep back into his heavy leather wallet. He frantically pulled out a shiny second credit card, a gold premium rewards card, and forcefully shoved it extremely hastily into the terminal's chip reader. The small machine hummed softly, the loading circle spun quickly again. Everyone sitting in the silent room leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding disaster. Another sharp, unforgiving beep pierced the total silence. The bright screen flashed red for a humiliating second time. Declined. The head waiter did not even need to speak. The loud rejection tone spoke clearly for itself. Andre's chest began to heave. He was hyperventilating, his ragged breathing shallow and fast. The tight collar of his cheap dress shirt was visibly damp with cold sweat. He aggressively yanked the gold card out and frantically dug through his wallet, rapidly pulling out a basic, generic third card. This specific one was a standard basic credit card, stripped of any supposed prestige or heavy metal flair. He slammed it into the machine, his shaking fingers slipping and fumbling in his desperate panic. He kept loudly muttering directly under his rapid breath, swearing at the unyielding machine, cursing the massive banking system, desperately praying for a sudden miracle that was never going to come. The indifferent machine processed the final desperate card. The agonizing wait felt like hours, then came the final brutal beep, red screen declined. 3 different credit cards, 3 humiliating public rejections. The exclusive VIP room of Lechiel felt like a tomb. The silence was absolute, complete, and utterly deafening. The illusion of his immense wealth, unchecked power, and fake prestige had evaporated, leaving behind a stark, ugly reality. The pious church elders began to rapidly whisper among themselves, their voices low, but carrying a heavy tone of deep judgment and massive scandal. They leaned closely to one another, aggressively shooting harsh, critical glares directly at the sweating Andre and the horrified Beatrice. The superficial sorority sisters were furiously typing on their expensive phones, undoubtedly, happily broadcasting the explosive family meltdown to their social network. Beatrice was gripping the incredibly sharp edge of the marble table, so hard her knuckles were turning stark white. The violent twitch in her fake smile had drastically turned into a full-blown, horrified grimace of absolute horror. She was watching decades of carefully curated social standing crumble to dust, right in front of her absolute most important peers. Patrice was currently entirely in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. The sudden realization that they were inescapably trapped in a highly expensive, extremely high-end luxury restaurant with a nearly $10,000 massive bill and zero available means to pay finally crashed down upon her. She spun around in her plush chair, her eyes wide and frantic, and aggressively grabbed her husband's arm. She shook the terrified Dion roughly, her shrill voice a very desperate, venomous hiss. She demanded that he quickly pull out his wallet immediately to cover the bill and save the ruined family from this catastrophic public disgrace. Diane refused to move. He did not quickly reach for his wallet, instead he shrank far down into his seat, refusing to make any eye contact with anyone. The trap had forcefully snapped shut, but I was safe outside of its jaws. I sat quietly at the far end of the long table, calmly sipping my sparkling water, intensely watching the absolute, satisfying destruction of my husband's fake empire unfold as I knew it would. The heavy silence broke with a violent crack. Beatrice slammed her open palm flat directly against the hard marble table. The sudden impact loudly rattled the expensive crystal glassware and sent an aggressive, visible shockwave through the paralyzed room. The sharp sound immediately snapped everyone out of their deep trance. Beatrice rose from her plush chair, her heavy, expensive sequined gown catching the bright restaurant light. Her chest heaved with deep, frantic indignation, the carefully crafted mask of the benevolent, deeply graceful church elder melted away, replaced entirely by the desperate, vicious face of a cornered woman watching her entire social standing rapidly evaporate. She aggressively pointed a wildly trembling finger directly at my calm face. She did not ask for my help, she highly aggressively demanded absolute, unwavering obedience. Her shrill voice echoed incredibly loudly off the dark wood-paneled walls, commanding and desperate. She ordered me to immediately pull out my credit card and stop this ridiculous, childish embarrassment right now. She loudly screamed that I was publicly shaming our entire pristine family name right in front of the respected congregation. She violently wielded absolute church authority, aggressively quoting scripture and out of context, demanding my immediate, complete financial submission. She very loudly reminded the entire terrified room that a supposedly godly, obedient wife always quietly supports her strong husband, effortlessly covers his supposed temporary shortcomings, and protects the ultimate sanctity of the family unit. She commanded me to act like a proper, respectful daughter-in-law, pay the outstanding restaurant bill without another single word of complaint, and immediately beg for their forgiveness for supposedly causing such a scandalous, massive disruption. The deeply uncomfortable elders nodded hesitantly, blindly clinging directly to the familiar rhetoric of patriarchal control, desperate for the terrifying, awkward situation to be resolved well so they could finally escape the suffocating tension. They wanted me to quietly absorb the financial ruin so they could happily go right back to eagerly pretending they associated with true, untouchable wealth and unwavering religious purity. Beatrice stared down her arrogant nose at me, her dark eyes aggressively burning with sheer, arrogant expectation. She genuinely believed her prominent church position explicitly granted her absolute, unchecked power over me. I did not flinch. I did not respectfully bow my head in deep shame, nor did I slowly reach into my heavy designer purse to quickly pacify her towering rage. I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact, directly with my furious, sweating mother-in-law. I calmly reached out with slow, incredibly deliberate precision, and elegantly picked up my crystal glass. I took a long, measured sip of my cold, sparkling water. The heavy ice clinked softly against the expensive rim, the absolute only sound answering her furious, ridiculous demands. I gracefully set the glass back down on the pristine linen coaster. I cleared my throat very quietly and let my voice naturally carry across the dead, utterly silent room. I loudly and unequivocally declined. I stated highly firmly that I would absolutely not be paying a single, solitary cent toward their 9,450 feast. I clearly told Beatrice that my total submission was completely not for sale, and my personal, guarded bank accounts were not a limitless slush fund for her fraudulent, desperate social climbing games. The absolute, total finality in my calm voice struck the silent room like a heavy physical blow. Several of the younger sorority sisters gasped loudly aloud. One of the shocked church elders tightly clutched his chest, as if he had just personally witnessed a genuine, horrifying blasphemy. Beatrice staggered back a heavy step, her shaking hand flying incredibly fast to her jeweled throat in absolute, genuine shock. She had never been spoken directly to with such blatant, calm defiance, especially not by the supposedly weak woman she considered beneath her notice. My calm refusal hung in the air, completely severing the absolute last remaining threads of their fake control. I was not actively playing their incredibly twisted game anymore. I refused to continue being the convenient, silent scapegoat. I refused to be their silent financier. I sat tall in my tailored emerald suit, unbothered by the huge, collective gasp of absolute horror that swept through the entire VIP suite. The carefully constructed narrative they had relied upon was rapidly burning to the ground, and I was calmly holding the lit match. The entire crowded room watched me intensely. Andre suddenly shattered right then and there. The tailored, successful, endlessly patient husband act he had deeply maintained all evening disintegrated. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the hard table, leaning aggressively toward me. The thick veins in his sweating neck aggressively bulged against his restrictive, tight collar. His terrified face rapidly turned a dangerous deep shade of dark crimson. He lost his fragile temper in the spectacular, most terrifying way imaginable. He loudly screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his breaking voice raw with sheer panic and vicious, uncontrollable anger. He called me a cheap, ungrateful woman who possessed zero understanding of deep, true family loyalty. He aggressively yelled that I was maliciously embarrassing him on purpose, trying to ruin the absolute most important night of his mother's entire life, simply just because I was deeply bitter and intensely stingy. He loudly roared that he had personally, supposedly given me the entire world, happily provided me with a beautiful home, and elevated my pathetic, non-existent social status simply by marrying me. He demanded to loudly know how I could possibly be so selfish, so heartless as to calmly sit there and actively watch his perfect family suffer such a profound, public humiliation. He hurled fierce insults like heavy stones, stripping away every single ounce of his polished, fake charm, to reveal the insecure, volatile, pathetic man hiding underneath. The shocked church elders physically recoiled far back in their plush seats, their wide eyes filled with absolute shock, as they directly witnessed the true violent nature of the supposedly flawless man they had praised just an hour earlier. The supposed golden boy of the wealthy congregation was currently aggressively screaming unhinged obscenities directly at his calm wife over a restaurant bill he could not afford. Patrice quickly covered her open mouth, suddenly heavily realizing that her aggressive brother was completely powerless. Dion quietly continued to stare blankly at his black phone screen, paralyzed by absolute, deep fear. Andre kept aggressively screaming, his spittle flying across the long marble table. He ordered me to pay the bill right now or face the absolute, complete destruction of everything. He genuinely thought his unhinged rage would instantly intimidate me into immediate, tearful compliance. He foolishly thought, raising his aggressive voice would completely force me to instantly submit to his fake masculine authority. He was severely mistaken. I calmly let finish his pathetic, unhinged tirade. I completely let him expose his true, violent character to every single person in that highly crowded room. When he finally aggressively stopped screaming to desperately catch his extremely ragged breath, loudly panting like a highly cornered, terrified animal, I simply smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that actively contained absolutely zero warmth. I leaned calmly forward, gently resting my forearms completely on the cool marble table. I kept my steady voice level, ensuring every single word cut through the heavy silence with surgical precision. I calmly informed Andre, the shaking Beatrice, and the entire captive audience that his supposedly premium credit cards were not aggressively declining due to some random, unfortunate bank error. I clearly stated that high net worth security protocols had nothing to do with this embarrassing, public display. I looked directly into Andre's panicked, terrified eyes and calmly delivered the first fatal blow. I clearly told the silent room that his premium cards were declining precisely because all of his financial accounts had been legally frozen by the Central Fraud Department at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning. The room stopped breathing. The heavy silence drastically shifted from shocked to utterly terrified. Andre's sweating jaw dropped open, his aggressive, threatening posture collapsing instantly. I happily watched the horrifying, deep realization wash over him, draining the absolute remaining color from his face. I continued, very calmly raising my highly steady voice, just enough to ensure the highly terrified church elders clearly heard every single devastating syllable clearly. I smoothly explained that major banking institutions do not freeze personal financial accounts simply for ordering too much expensive lobster or blindly buying a pricey bottle of imported vintage champagne. They strictly freeze accounts precisely when they clearly detect highly completely unauthorized, illegal activities. I deliberately let the heavy word illegal echo in the vast, silent room. The young sorority sisters stopped secretly recording the ongoing fight. The pious church elders openly stared at Andre with a profound, totally newfound sense of creeping dread. Beatrice let out a soft, pathetic whimpering sound, suddenly understanding that the unpaid restaurant bill was the absolute least of her severely ruined family's rapidly mounting problems. I smiled calmly again, feeling the immense, satisfying power of the brutal, undeniable truth radiating completely through my entire veins. I had patiently held on to this devastating secret all day incredibly long, quietly sitting peacefully entirely through their countless, vicious insults, their relentless microaggressions, and their ridiculous, impossible financial demands. I had patiently waited for the absolute, totally perfect moment to strike back, and they had completely, willingly handed it directly to me on a gleaming, polished silver platter. The heavy spark had finally been lit, and the resulting inferno was about to consume them all. They had tried to break me, but they had only succeeded in sealing their inescapable doom. The absolute power dynamic in the silent room had fundamentally shifted forever in my absolute favor right now. Andre desperately opened his mouth to desperately speak, to offer some desperate fabricated lie, but no clear words came out. He was suffocated by the heavy weight of his own criminal exposure. He slumped back directly into his expensive, plush dining chair, looking like a completely deflated, entirely broken man. The facade of the supposedly wealthy, successful financial advisor was permanently shattered, leaving only a terrified, pathetic criminal exposed for the entire judgmental congregation to judge. Beatrice tightly clutched her heavy chest, her expensive diamond necklace, suddenly looking like a highly heavy, suffocating metal chain around her neck. She looked at her supposedly perfect, flawless son, her dark eyes wide with absolute, sheer horror and rapidly dawning realization. The glorious celebration she had aggressively orchestrated had miraculously transformed into the highly public, devastating sight of her entire family's ultimate public execution. They had pushed me too far, arrogantly assuming my long silence was complete weakness. Now they were going to learn the severely brutal consequences of backing a successful, intelligent, prepared woman into a dark, tight corner. I did not break steady eye contact with my terrified husband as I slowly reached directly down to the pristine floor. My hand calmly wrapped around the smooth, heavy leather handle of my oversized, expensive designer tote bag. I highly effortlessly hoisted the heavy bag onto my lap, the shiny metal hardware loudly clinking softly against the polished edge of the marble table. The sharp sound was deafening in the completely dead, silent room. Everyone watched my smooth movements with deeply breathless anticipation. Andre stared at my bag exactly as if it contained a live explosive device. His sweating chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. He knew what was precisely inside. He knew his fabricated, fake life was over. I confidently grasped the shiny gold zipper and aggressively pulled it open with a sharp, decisive motion. I bypassed my expensive wallet. I did not need any credit cards or cash tonight. Instead, I reached deep into the main compartment and smoothly retrieved a massive, tightly bound folder. It was 2 incredibly thick inches heavy with irrefutable proof. I smoothly lifted the heavy folder out of the bag and aggressively slammed it down onto the polished table. The heavy thud loudly echoed off the dark wood-paneled walls, causing the terrified Beatrice to visibly jump entirely in her plush seat. I calmly placed my manicured hand flat against the thick glossy cover and looked directly at the sweating Andre. With a forceful, massive shove, I slid the heavy folder straight entirely down the exact center of the long marble table. It smoothly glided fast over the polished surface, bypassing the empty champagne flutes and the discarded, pathetic lobster shells. It came to a sudden violent halt directly in front of the terrified Beatrice and Andre. The heavy folder burst open upon the impact, spilling a massive mountain of incredibly pristine, brightly colored banking documents across the pure white linen tablecloth. They were extremely high resolution, certified copies of our highly detailed financial history. Every single transaction, every hidden wire transfer, and every single forged signature was now displayed for the captive dinner party to witness. I calmly stood up completely from my plush chair, ensuring my steady voice carried to the absolute furthest, quiet corners of the VIP suite. I commanded the terrified church elders to look closely at those documents. I loudly announced that Andre did not merely suffer a temporary unfortunate banking glitch. I calmly revealed the horrific truth. I firmly stated that my supposedly loving, devoted husband had secretly accessed our primary joint savings account early this morning. I clearly told the silent room that this account contained our absolutely entire life savings, immense money we had supposedly highly securely set aside entirely for our massive future family and highly critical emergency investments. The exact total amount was $120,000. The incredibly collective gasp from the shocked church elders sounded like all the heavy oxygen was suddenly sucked out of the room. $120,000 was a truly staggering, massive sum entirely to these superficial people, a fortune they could absolutely barely comprehend, completely losing in a highly single, brief morning. Beatrice turned ashen, her shaking hands trembling incredibly as she stared directly down at the brightly highlighted bank statements practically touching her empty plate. I did not entirely give them a single, fleeting moment to recover from the initial shock. I calmly kept loudly speaking, actively driving the absolute, undeniable truth into their terrified minds like a heavy hammer. I clearly told them where every single stolen penny had gone. I pointed directly at the silent Andre, who was now gripping his sweaty hair and staring blankly at the polished table. I loudly informed the horrified congregation that my highly pathetic husband had drained that joint account entirely without my knowledge or required consent. I loudly explained that he bypassed the strict bank security protocols by forging my precise signature on a highly totally irrevocable wire transfer document. The shocked church elders began highly rapidly murmuring in sheer, absolute horror. Heavy forgery was a severe federal felony, a crime that carried serious prison time. They fiercely looked directly at Andre with intense, deep disgust, finally seeing the pathetic, lying criminal completely hiding behind his cheap tailored suit and his arrogant smile. Patrice aggressively leaned far over, desperately trying to frantically read the scattered paperwork, completely resting entirely near her terrified mother. She demanded to loudly know what Andre had bought with that much stolen cash. I smoothly smiled a cold, victorious smile. I calmly told the terrified Patrice that her supposedly beloved, successful brother did not spend the stolen funds entirely on high-yield investments or charitable, fake church donations. I loudly announced that Andre heavily wired $85,000 to exclusive luxury car dealership across the town. He easily purchased a totally brand new, fully loaded, extremely expensive Porsche, directly straight off the shiny showroom floor. The absolute incredible audacity of the purchase sent a highly fresh wave of horrified, loud whispers through the stunned audience. Revenge is a dish best served with a side of complete financial ruin. A queen does not need to scream to prove she wears a crown. Revenge is a dish best served with a side of complete financial ruin. Silence is truly the ultimate weapon in a world obsessed with loud, empty noise.